Hey, welcome back. So in this episode we're going to be touching base on ignition timing. What is ignition timing? What do you need to set your ignition to? What are some considerations about ignition timing? How to set up an inner rotor. So getting right into it, what is ignition timing? Well, timing is the advance or retard of spark in your motor. So as the piston is coming up, the spark event doesn't happen at the very top. It usually happens before the piston is coming up, which is known as advance timing. Confusing, but let me show you. So as the piston is coming up the bore, the spark event will happen. And depending on piston speed, so RPM, the amount of squish, so once the ports close over and it starts compressing the fuel mixture, it has it so that the spark event happens at peak cylinder, before peak cylinder pressure, so that as the flame front propagates, it allows the piston to come back down. If the explosion happens before the piston gets over a certain point, the motor can kick back and it'll actually run backwards. Ask me how I know. I actually had this thing running backwards when I was messing around with this kit. It's pretty funny. Also, fun fact, Harley-Davidson golf carts, the motors run forward and reverse. That's how they have reverse on them. Advanced timing basically means the more advance you have, the farther down the bore the piston is as it's coming up in its travel. So what are some drawbacks to just putting a whole bunch of advance into your bike? Well, a lot of it has to do with heat. I'm not an expert on it, but the more you have the force, the spark force, and the piston down in the bore, the more time that your combustion stays in the cylinder, the more heat builds up in the cylinder. You can hold a piston that way, again, because you have to think of it like, although you want the spark to ignite and the piston to come up and then come back down in its stroke, you want a lot of that. You want the pressure of that to push the piston down, but you want the heat to go out the exhaust, because if the heat stays in here too long, then it starts to heat everything up, and then that's when you see a melted piston from spark anyway. I mean, you can hold a piston from running too lean. There's lots of ways you can hold a piston, but if you start putting the advance too far down, it starts building heat, basically. You have that flame front happening for longer in the bore, and heat is the result. So on a two-stroke, what do you want your timing curve to be? Well, according to men much smarter than myself, you want it to be about 25 degrees when it's off the pipe. So that's like off throttle. Off throttle, usually you see it at around 30 or somewhere in that range. And then under the pipe in around 25 degrees. And then on the pipe at around 15 degrees. And then anything over the peak horsepower, you want to start tapering it off. For example, I have seen a few NSR 125 and 250 timing curves, Aprilia timing curves, and a lot of them, yeah, they usually are around 30 to start and then taper down to like 8 or 5 degrees at 12k or 14k or whatever they're spinning them to. That's just a ballpark. There's lots of factors that make timing different for everything. You can't just say, oh, it's this, because there are other factors in the motor that play into that. So a lot of the time it's something that you kind of have to play around with if you want to get peak horsepower for your setup. Obviously, a dyno definitely helps in that area, because you can do back-to-back runs, mess around with the timing a little bit, see if you gain horsepower, lose horsepower. If you have an EGT gauge, you can see if you're running hotter, coolant temp sensor, etc. So that's beneficial to do it on a dyno. It's a lot harder to do if you're just doing like runs, but it's not impossible. So how do a lot of these work? Well, these style, like the inner rotor style, It's just the rise and fall of a magnet. It's actually the collapsing of a magnetic field that actually sends the voltage to the coil and fires it. So there's a bunch of windings in here, and then two plated steel, like steel plating, like a whole bunch of little thin pieces put together. And then you have a north and a south pole, and then every time that poles switch, it creates current and fires it out to the coil. So with these guys, a lot of them, they don't actually have a key. And the reason they don't have a key is because they don't weigh very much and they don't have a lot of mass outside. You couldn't really do that with a stock flywheel. You'd end up probably destroying your spline or your taper on your crank, just because there's so much heavier and the weight is further out. These are all different. Like it really just depends on where the fields swap around, where they need to be set. So for example, this is my MVT DD that is actually for a Minarelli, like BWS. In their instruction sheet, although it's in French, luckily I am French, but I can't speak it very well. They say you can set it 0.35 is a good starting point for that. In the Melosi stuff, which is this Selettra unit, they're saying you should set it to 2.3 millimeters. So what does that mean? Well, this is a micrometer for setting a piston stop micrometer, basically. So this turns in and out. This one is a Bazzetti, I think. I don't even, maybe just a Moto Force. But it has graduations all along the thimble here, similar to a micrometer. So the thread on the inside, which I have checked on this one, is 1 millimeter pitch. So that means for every full turn of this back to zero, you have 1 millimeter of this moving in. This only works on pistons on cylinders that have a non-angled head. If you have an angled head, you're going to have to figure out the angle from center line of the bore and then do trig to figure out how much you actually need to move this to set your theoretical stop depth, because they're not the same. They just can't be. So how do you set this up? Well, it's pretty simple. You'd wind this guy in. You would set this down and lock this part too. You don't want this to move around. And I should also mention, so this paper sheet, I printed it out on from 49ccforums.com. In their template section, they have one of these. If you print it out a little bit bigger than I did. I think I printed it at 20% bigger than the number, and then I just cut it out and stick it on there. So I have some type of ability to see degrees rationally. I find it's a lot easier to set up, and when you bust out the timing light later to actually check it, it makes it much easier, considerably so. So wind in your piston stop until it threads in all the way. You don't want it loose in there because it makes it harder to understand what you're actually reading. Piston stop is all the way in. So you wind the motor over until you hit the stop. So in my case, I've hit the stop and I'm pointing at about 70 degrees. So then you take the motor and you wind it over the other way, all the way. Until you hit the stop. And in this case, it's on 140. So 140 degrees and 70 degrees, that means that there's 70 degrees difference between the two. And then you divide that number in half and you bring your line to that point. Now this one's already set up, so the lines are going to basically meet up, but 40, 10, 20, 35. So yeah, if I wind this back around, I can't because the piston stop is all the way down, but I can wind that out. Now you want to leave the base down, but you want to wind the thimble out. So one other thing to always kind of take into consideration, there is a small amount of play in everything inside of this. And I mean like a minuscule amount. There has to be, otherwise it would not spin. So when you're setting these, you always want to turn it in the direction of rotation to hit your mark and set your timing points. Again, because there's a small amount of play, it's such a minuscule number for this one, like 0.35, that's almost nothing. So just, yeah, always when you're setting the timing, you can go. So what I'll do now is I will have everything set. I will wind in the thimble until it hits. Okay, so I've come up against the thimble and now I wind it out just ever so slightly until the piston now goes back, and then you can check it again just by bringing it up against it, but you should be able to you should just feel the piston hitting the top, hitting the micrometer head and just like grazing it. So at this point on my thimble, I have a point that is at the 6. So my thimble is wound in and it's on the 6, so I need to add 0.35 to that. So I need to go to 9.5 basically is where I want this to be. So rotating it again in the direction that it's going to be going when it's running. Once it's clear of there, I will go to the thimble and I'll wind it until it hits the 9. Now if I wind this around, I've hit the stop. I have the marks lined up and the piston is against the stop. As you can see, there's a difference here. So what I would do in this case is loosen this, spin that down a little bit, and that would get it in a running state. With that said, I'm not going to do that right now because I have mine set to about 28 degrees of advance, and I know this because I've checked it with a timing light. This is just kind of like a step-by-step to show you how you would get to the point where I have this thing set up right now. So again, just loosen these, spin this thing around, or if you haven't put this on tight, cinch that up in that place. But I find it's easier to cinch the nut down with it close and then do the fine tuning with this. It's just way easier than trying to like get a wrench on there and get the thing to sit right and everything to be aligned. Get this as close as you can to here where it needs to be, and then simply tighten this up and then do your fine adjust with this. Once we have that done, we can pull a piston stop out. Oh, and one other thing I kind of glazed over, which I shouldn't have. When you set the 0 point of this, wherever this is, when you have 0 set, even if it means you have to go back in and refine the top, exactly top dead center, it's a little bit easier to do with a dial, like with an actual dial. The problem is on this bike, in order for me to run a dial, I gotta take all of the panels off of it. I don't really want to do that, but you will get much more accurate with a dial indicator, so you can sweep it and find the top point. This is a little bit cruder. It will get you close, and then you can do fine adjustments with timing light after anyway. So, but what you want to do, again, because I know that where this one is, that is top dead center because I set it earlier to that. So, as you can see on this motor, I'm actually running it almost at 0. With a timing light on this one, it seems like I am getting really close to about 28 or 29 degrees on the low end, and then as I rev it up, the curve drops down to almost like 5 degrees or so. So that seems pretty ideal for this. But I haven't done any dyno runs and played around with it or anything yet. Dyno is still a work in progress. I have some stuff I gotta still figure out on it. With all that done, you should be able to start the bike. You should be able to put this on and at least get it running. You can muck about with this a little bit, try and fine tune it, even just if it's, you know, being a little weird. You can always like loosen these screws, make a mark on the case, or make a Sharpie mark on the case in there so you can come back to it is a good trick to do. And then you can just move this around a little bit and find that sweet spot and at least get it running so it runs well enough that you can mess around with it further. But I think that's it for this evening. I think next video on this I will show you a little bit of the timing light side of it, how to kind of figure that stuff out. I will have a few prints of some timing curves to show you guys. Seletras and stuff you can usually find the timing curves for. MVT I haven't been able to find anything for, which is annoying because it's nice to be able to back up that your work is actually valid. You can't use a piston stop to check that the timing is right because you can't run the motor with a piston stop in it. However, with a timing light you can, and so if you know what degrees their curve is set their baseline to, you can then take the timing light and check it and make sure that the curve is, your base timing is in the right spot. But I'll cover all that. I'll try covering all that stuff in the next video. We'll go over it all and I'll show you kind of the curve working and how to figure that out. A few different posts and pictures of some graphs and stuff. And yeah, hopefully we'll come at it with a little more knowledge to stroke timing. But that's it for me. Until next time, take care.